In this video tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to make the beaded edge woven fine silver bracelet featuring the Flatwearable wire weaver. The video has been sped up to shorten the viewing time. If you want to watch it in real time and slow it down, click on the settings gear at the bottom of the video and adjust the playback speed. I'm using 8 wires for this project, and each of the wires consists of 2 strands of 22 gauge fine silver wire twisted in a counterclockwise fashion. And I did that by putting one end in the vise and the other end into a power drill. Each one of the strands, double wire strands, measures 12 inches long. So I'm just using the attachment on the wire weaver to weave this 8-strand bracelet. And really it's just a back and forth motion, back and forth motion. If you need more details on this weaving process, please check our most recent video showing the weaving process in more detail. And finishing up weaving here and taking it out of the clamp. And as you can see, it sure is not perfect looking. I had a question, well, why wouldn't you just do this more neatly? Then you wouldn't have to anneal and do all that fussing afterwards. Well, because I like doing it this way. I did lose a section of video where it showed the annealing and the stretching of the bracelet, but I do show that also in a recent video. And by annealing and pulling and stretching, tapping on either side with the rubber mallet, you can get really nice uniform sides and a very tight and compact weave. The process that I'm using here makes a very nice tight weave, much tighter than weaving it by hand. So I like the annealing process. So I cut off the excess wire on the ends and cut my bracelet to length, and I'm going to use 2 sections of 10 gauge beaded wire, and they're going to flank either side of the bracelet, and we're going to solder them on. If you are a wire wrapper, you can wire wrap this for a different look and not have to worry about soldering. Soldering to me is always preferable as a jewelry artist, but you do what you're comfortable with. But this would make a beautiful wire wrapped bracelet as well. So I'm using one of our newest tools. It's called the Whammer, and it has interchangeable heads for different purposes. If you want to know about the tools that are used in this video, you can check the description box underneath the video, and there's a link where you can purchase any of these tools. So I am taping these 3 sections together, and then I am using 26 gauge stainless steel binding wire to wrap everything tight. So you want to pull the wire very taut so you can bind all these 3 pieces together. We need as much surface contact between the beaded edge and the weaved edges. So once I have done that in 4 sections, then I'm going to take one long piece and I'm going to wrap the entire thing. I know some people would say, well, you know, it's way too much wire, it's overkill. Well, this is the way I do things. I want to make sure that I have as tight of a bundle as possible, and I use a lot of wire to do so. That way my bracelet isn't going to fall apart, and I'm going to get as much surface contact as possible. So I'm just wrapping one end to the other, pulling tightly as I go. Now tap anything down that needs to be tapped down to make the bracelet as straight and even as possible. Okay, because once it's soldered, or soldered, as people keep correcting me, in the US we say solder. And I am using paste solder for this purpose, and I'm not one to use a lot of paste solder, but for this application this really worked beautifully. And I'm just smearing it between the beaded wire and the mesh wires. And what it does is it's going to fill in between, actually it doesn't fill in, but it settles in between the mesh and the beaded wire, and it attaches the beaded wire beautifully. So I'm using my torch here. One thing about paste solder, because it contains this pasty flux, the flux will start to flame, catch on fire. Just wait for that to extinguish, and then you can continue using your torch. Heating the entire piece from end to end. Now this is going to take a little bit longer than usual because the stainless steel wire acts as a heat sink, so it's pulling some of the heat away from the bracelet itself. So it does take a little bit longer when you have something like binding wire on your pieces. Once everything is heated, then I'm going to start at one end, work towards the other end, and allow the solder to flow. I'm running out of fuel in my acetylene, so I wasn't getting enough heat to get the piece up to proper temperature. So I do end up switching over to a MAP gas, which runs very, very hot, and was not something I would normally use for this type of work, especially fine silver, because it melts so easily. But it's what I had on hand. Now you can see the metal is glowing, and once it's nice and glowing like that, you know the solder has flowed properly. So I'm going to quench that in water. Do not pickle at this point. Do not put it into your mild acid solution to clean the silver. If you do put it in with the binding wire on there, you're going to find your silver becomes pink. So you must remove all of the binding wire prior to putting it into your pickle solution. If you're not familiar with annealing and pickling, there are a number of videos on YouTube that describe the process in more detail. Everything was cleaned up and pickled, and I've gone through my scrap box, silver scrap box, and found a really nice patterned scrap section of sheet material. I believe this is about 18 gauge. It was a little too heavy for me to bend by hand, so I did anneal it. And I'm laying my bracelet section on there, marking it, then folding with pliers and pushing it with my hand to fold it over. Marking the other side, and then I'm marking the width. So I'm going to fold again at the first mark. Now it becomes a little three-sided section for our end cap. Checking the measurements on that. Now I'm going to trim off the excess piece where I have that second Sharpie line. And then using the Whammer, I'm going to fold that over, and we're going to solder at that seam. Some Mighty Flux, and I'm going to place a couple of hard solder chips where those two pieces, where the metal joins together, and using my torch, allow the solder to flow to close up that end cap seam. I'm just using my pliers at the end to make sure everything is sealed and both pieces, both ends of that end cap are joined together. And cleaning off, trimming off the excess. I will be trimming off the excess. First I am going to solder the cap onto the bracelet using medium solder. Now I'm going to trim off the excess. You could trim off the excess at really at any point. And then using a number 2 file to blend in that seam. I normally would do filing on my bench pen, but for the purpose of video instruction, I'm just holding it on my workbench. You have to be really careful because this sheet material is patterned. I want to be careful not to file into the pattern and only file on the edge. And clean up that top edge and prepare it for putting the end piece on. Again, just taking some scrap material, cutting a piece that's going to fit over the end. I'm going to sweat solder this on. So I'm heating up the little scrap, adding some medium solder with a stick soldering, which is just feeding solder in with wire solder, feeding it in by hand. So sweat soldering is a matter of putting solder on one or both pieces that you're working with, and then using a torch to bring those pieces up to temperature and allow the solder to flow. And successfully added that piece on. And using my shears, metal shears, trimming off the excess. Doing it this way means that you do not have to have a cap onto the top onto the end cap. You don't have to have it perfect and have it perfectly centered and perfectly in place. So if you start out with a larger piece, then trim off the excess, you'll have a perfect fit. So just using my file and a sanding block, cleaning that all up there. And that really makes a beautiful end cap. So I did the other end, quenched and pickled, and now I'm putting it into the ultrasonic. I did put it on the bench buffer with white compound, which is a cutting compound. I did that prior to putting it into the ultrasonic. If you watch carefully, you can see the excess compound start to come out of the mesh. It's really just about impossible to clean up mesh, cleaning up buffing compounds in mesh unless you have an ultrasonic cleaner. I added liver of sulfur to the piece to darken everything up. Now I am removing the excess liver of sulfur with a buffing block. And forming the bracelet around an oval wood bracelet mandrel and shaping it with the Whammer. Once I did the shaping, it went into the tumbler with 920 compound, which is a burnishing compound, in stainless steel shot. And that is how the nice bright shiny finish ends up coming about. And you can see how absolutely gorgeous this bracelet becomes. So fine silver wire is your mesh, and sterling silver is the beaded edge and the end caps. Makes for a very beautiful, beautiful bracelet. If you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe so you'll be notified when we release new videos. If you have any questions, please post them and I would be happy to give you an answer.